Welcome back. We are almost finished with Crispin. Today I'll be reading chapters 54 through 56. We'll be starting on page 263 if you do have a book. Chapter 54. We reached a square not long after the church bells rang for matins. As soon as we arrived, the man who had guided me disappeared without a word. I looked over the square. The bright moon revealed a field of empty tables and stalls deserted by its trader swarms. All lay in uneasy silence, putting me in mind of the abandoned village where I had first met Bear. But here at one end of the square stood the palace of the Furnivals. It was huge and dark, save for the two windows on the second level. There some dim light glimmered. Opposite at the other side of the square, the great church rose up in all of its majesty, the stained glass windows glowing faintly like the embers of a smoldering fire. As I stood and listened, I heard the sound of a chanting coming from the church. Priests were at their early prayers. Their blended voices rolled across the square like a rising and falling wind. Media vita in morte sumus, quem quormus adoremo, nisi te domine, qui pro peccatus nostris juste isregos, Sancte Deus. I made the sign of the cross over my heart, imploring St. Giles to guide and help me as he had done before. Then I turned to the palace where Bear was being held. Even as I wondered if he was alive, I spied some movement by the central doors to the lower level. Shielding myself behind some deserted stalls and tables, I made my way closer to the palace. When I peeked out, I saw two guards standing by the main doors. One of the men was leaning back. His arms were folded over his chest, his head bent down. He gave the impression of being asleep. The other guard was pacing restlessly. I crept closer and studied the building. It was quite clear that there would be no getting past the main door guards. How then could I possibly find a way inside? Then I recalled seeing John Acleef on the balcony. Perhaps the second level was not so guarded. The problem was to get there. I moved along the square so I could examine the far side of the palace building. There, other buildings crowded in. In the moonlight, what I discovered was what was between the palace and the next building. There existed only a slight separation. It was hardly more than a crevice, not big enough for a man to squeeze into. But I was still a boy. After waiting until the restless guard moved as far away as he would likely to go, I darted forward and squeezed into the breach I'd found. It was so narrow I went in sideways. It was too dark to see much, but I could feel around. The palace walls were jagged stone. The wall opposite was made of rough clay or plaster. I put down Bear's sack. If I returned, I could retrieve it. If I didn't return, it wouldn't matter. Barely able to turn about, I was like a kernel of what between two stones. I pressed my hands against the opposing walls. Using my fingertips to grasp small edges and bumps, I began to move slowly up. When high enough off the ground, I lifted my legs and pushed my feet against the walls so as to gain even more purchase. Straining every bit of the way, I would climb the walls like a spider. Exactly how long it took me to reach the balcony, I don't know. It was higher than the roof of the Stromford church. Even when I reached the level of the balcony, I was not where I needed to be. The balcony jutted out beyond the building's front walls, whereas I was lodged against the side wall. Pushing my back hard against the palace stone, while my feet pressed against the clay wall, I managed to turn about. Now I was about to wedge myself secretly in a place where even I freed my hands. Just beneath the balcony, a carving stone of a lion. Just beneath the balcony, a stone carving of a lion, its jagged mouth agape protruded. By stretching one arm out to the utmost, I was able to reach the beast's lower jaw. Grasping it firmly, I released the pressure of my body from the walls. I swung out, holding to the lion's mouth with one hand legs dangling high above the ground and the guards below. With my other hand, I stretched up and clutched the balcony itself. Now I was clinging to the balcony with one hand. I moved the other hand up, so I was now dangling with two hands. Even as I swung my feet to gain some purchase, I hauled myself up, pulling and pulling again until I finally hoisted myself over the balcony railing. To my greater relief, no one was there. As far as I could tell, the guards below had not seen me. Legs shaking from my effort, I stood on the balcony and gathered my breath. Not daring to waste any time, I hurriedly crept inside an open balcony door. In so doing, I entered a dim and narrow hall. I neither heard nor said anything or saw anything to cause an alarm. Only at the farthest end where some feeble light existed. I looked about the area into which I was coming, and nothing more of a shallow entryway. I edged forward, pausing to notice doors on either side of the little hall. I set my ear to one of them. When I heard nothing, I pushed it in. In the faint moonlight that came through a small window, I only saw flags of wooden poles. I turned it to the other side, listened, and pushed it open too. Along one of was a rack of glaives. Another was broadswords. A third held some daggers. I took up one of the daggers, then withdrew, shutting the door behind me. I now moved forward to the end of the entry hall, leaned forward to peer in, and gasped. Chapter 55. Illuminated by light cast from a few all but guttered candles and wall sconces was a room of vast size. It was far bigger than any room I'd ever seen before, large enough to contain more than 100 souls. All of Stromford could have been crowded in. The wooden ceiling was decorated and carved in interlocking flowers and vines. Walls bore panel after panel, finely wrought upon the painted images of saints that had been set. At the far end, just opposite where I stood, was a gigantic fireplace faced with stone and painted tiles. The dull remnants of a fire burned. Close to the hearth on the other side of the room was what appeared to be a stairway. Before the hearth stood a massive, long table with benches and chairs. The table was littered with heaped remains of what must have been a great feast. Bones, breads, bottles, and bowls lay scattered everywhere, as if a ferocious giant had gathered to dine. There were mazers and trenchers, knives, and napkins and goblets and things that I hardly knew, and more than I could count. In the dimness, I was able to make out a number of doors set in the walls. One of these doors was open. From the room beyond, a light flickering light emerged. I went to it and, moving cautiously, peeked in. I'd come upon something very much like a church, but it was still a room. At first glance, the room seemed to contain nothing but gold that burned with a richness my eyes could barely absorb. These golden surfaces were encrusted with countless jewels, blue, purple, and red, which in the flickering candlelight seemed to pulse with the life of their own. All in all, it was more wealth than I ever could have imagined existed on this planet. At its far end was an altar upon which stood a cross of light of gleaming gold. Before the cross were some lighted candles that brought illumination to the room. To one side of these candles were jeweled boxes, probably containing saintly relics. Spellbound by such magnificence, I stepped farther inside. It was then that I saw the walls and ceilings were covered with images of holy souls. Their deep, dark eyes gazed down with me in such penetrating grief and wisdom I did not doubt they peered into my very heart. Then I realized that on the altar a single image had been placed. It had been set to the other side of the candles, opposite of the relic boxes. Here, within a jewel-studded frame, our glorious lady in her flowing robes of blue was revealed. Kneeling on the ground before her was a knight in full armor, hands clasped in prayer, his face uplifted toward the Virgin. To my utter amazement, I recognized the face of the knight. It was my own, the very one I'd looked upon in the stream where Bear had made me cut my hair and wash my face. But now, as sure as I knew anything, I realized I was looking upon the image of my father. Feeling anger and curiosity, I drew closer. The kneeling man appeared so devout and so adoring of Our Lady. Yet I knew him otherwise, a lofty lord with kindness or caring for my mother. A lofty lord without kindness or caring for my mother. As for me, I doubted if he had any thought at all. Just to see him in his exalted state made me know the finality that I was not him. No, not in any part. I was myself, what I had become. Thus I sank to my knees and, putting aside my dagger, prayed that God on his throne, with my mother on his side, would judge Lord Furnival for what he truly was. I was completely absorbed when a voice behind me said, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I sprang to my feet and turned about. It was John Cliff. Chapter 56. Cliff's black bearded face, hard, sharp eyes, and frowning lips were frighteningly familiar. So was his sword at his side. The more I gazed on him, the more panic rose in my eyes turned toward the floor. "You," he said into the silence. "Asta's son." Though it was a struggle to lift my eyes, I did, and his gaze showed much disdain. I could feel my wrath rise within. Here was the man who had been so cruel to my mother, who had treated me with such contempt and wished me dead, who had murdered Father Quinnell, who had abducted Bear. "The wolf's head," he said. "How dare such a filthy peasant as you presume to put your foot within this place?" He turned toward the entryway. If you're intending to call the guards," I said, "tell them Lord Furnival's son has come." He halted and turned back to me. His swarthy face had become pale. "What did you say?" "I am Crispin," I said, working to keep my gaze steady on my face. "Lord Furnival's son." I saw him glance over my shoulder at the image of Lord Furnival, comparing me to him. "You're nothing of the kind," he said, and once again turned to go. "You know what I've said is true," I said, hoping he wouldn't hear the quiver in my voice. "You've always known." Again he paused. "You're not even human," was his reply. "I have proof," I insisted. "You can't prove what isn't so." In haste, I took out my cross of lead from my leather pouch. "It's written here," I said, holding it up. It was my mother's, given to me when she died. She wrote the words in it. "Words? What words?" "It reads, Crispin, son of Furnival." For a moment, he was still. Then he said, "Anyone can write words." "Not anyone," I said with a growing anger. "It was my mother, and I believe them, as do others. And people will need to look upon me and know who I am. And when I say I am the grandson of Lord Douglas—" "Give that cross to me," he cried, holding out his hand. "No," I said, "it belongs to me." Furious, he stepped forward and lifted a fist as though to strike to me. In response, I held my hand using the cross that rested in my palm as a shield. He hesitated. "I know what happened," I said. "Lord Furnival brought my mother to Stromford. He left her there with me, making you our keeper, and granting us only a living death. When Richard du Bray came to Strongford with the news that my father had returned to England and was mortally ill, you were charged with killing me. It's you who fear me. You fear I'll become your Lord. He made no response, but his eyes told me that I was right. It was you who killed Father Quinnell, I went on, to keep him from telling me who I was. It was you who said I was the thief and proclaimed me as the wolf's head, so that any man might kill me. Your mother was nothing but a servant. Aycliffe said, she was too low to reach so high. She forgot her place. It didn't serve her well. There's an order to things which God himself has put in place. It can never be changed. How can you expect to stand against it? I came from something else, I said, hardly able to contain my fury. Money, he said. Your soldiers took a friend of mine. He said nothing. He goes by the name of Bear. I continued, a great red-bearded man. What about him? If you let the two of us, both him and me, leave Great Wexley, we'll never come back. You'll never see us again. After a moment, he said, how can I be sure? I lifted my trembling hand. I'll swear it on this cross. You forgot, he said. You're a wolf's head. All that I have to do is call the guards. Anyone may kill you. You're nothing. So saying, he turned about and stepped from the room. I reacted by reaching down, snatching up the dagger, and leaping forward, flinging myself to his back. I took him by such surprise with a cry that he stumbled, tripped, and fell, crashing to the ground. Even as he struggled to reach his sword, I was on him again, knocking him down a second time. I pressed the dagger's point into his neck. If you call the guards, I'll kill you. I cried, pushing his face to the floor. Panting heavily, he made no response. Summoning all my strength, I drew the blade against his neck. Blood began to flow. What you wanted for me, I said, it's about to happen to you. Will you, he whispered desperately, swear upon that cross and in the name of God that if I let you go, or if I let you and this man go, you'll never come back and you'll make no claim about the house of Furnival? Willingly. And you'll give me that cross? When we have passed through the city gates, even as I spoke, I worked up to keep my hand steady, and he never ceased to feel the pressure of my dagger's point. But you, I said, must swear first. I will, he said, as though it was a painful thing to say. I released him. He sat up and touched his neck, looking at the blood that smeared his fingers. Swear, I said, holding up to the cross of lead, but keeping the dagger near. He hesitated, but then he said, in the sacred name of Jesus, I, John Aycliffe, swear that I shall allow you, Asta's son, and the man called Bear, to leave the city insofar that you have sworn never to return, never to claim Lord Furnival to be your father, and to leave the cross with me. Then I said, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, I, Crispin, do swear that if you let Bear go, he and I will leave Great Wexley and never return, nor will I ever make the claim that Lord Furnival was my father. Furthermore, once out of the city, I'll give you the cross. Now, I said, take me to Bear. His reply was to gaze at me with eyes full of hate, but then he got to his feet and began to walk away, saying, follow me. Thank you for listening, and if we don't get to see each other before the end of the school year, have a great summer, and we'll see you back next fall.